So welcome to our 11 o'clock session. The energy regulation, the fixes needed to support decarbonization of remote diesel grids. We admittedly are, a little nervous up here. We were not supposed to be on the main stage. We were supposed to be in a small room. And we had planned kind of a small group discussion. So what we're going to try and do is pivot here to a large group discussion. So there's going to be lots of opportunities to contribute. And we're going to be sharing a bit about our research, but we really want to spur dialogue with this session. Look for collaborative solutions, look for opportunities to build consensus, and also pathways to advance advocacy moving forward. So we're really looking forward to having you all in the room. As originally we were going to do introductions, but we obviously don't have time for that in this room. So in lieu of introductions, what I'd love to do is see where everyone is coming from. So would you please stand up if you're from the Yukon, if you're from this territory? Okay. And now take your seats. How about the Northwest Territories? Okay, only a couple, but good. Strong contingent. Now, what do we have next? Nunavut? Anyone? Oh, okay, a couple people, great. And lastly, for the jurisdictions we studied in our report, which we'll be talking about, is BC. From BC. Excellent, nice to see you all. And then for everyone else, so if you're from one of the other jurisdictions in Canada, please. Okay, we've got quite a lot. Excellent. So, spoiler alert, our most recent regulatory report does not study your jurisdictions, I'm sorry. Our most recent report studies BC and the territories, but hopefully some of the lessons we've learned are going to be transferable to all jurisdictions. So let's start by introducing ourselves. I'm Arthur Bledsoe, Senior Analyst with the Pembina Institute.
I'm Rosa Brown. I'm also a senior analyst with the Pembina Institute, and both of us work for the Renewables in Remote Communities program.
So yeah, Rosa, do you want to tell them a little bit about our recent research?
Sure. So most of you know the Pembina Institute in our role in convening, which is the conference that we're at today and we're at every couple years. But the Pembina Institute is a clean energy think tank. And when we're not hosting great conferences like this, we're back at our desks conducting research and writing reports. So today we're going to tell you about a research report that is due to be published any day or week now. And this is it here on the screen. And in this research, what we did was we were just looking at regulatory systems in the jurisdictions that aren't mentioned and doing a bit of an analysis on how they support diesel reduction in the remote diesel communities, and also how they may support Indigenous leadership in these areas.
So yeah, like I said, we were planning for this to be a bit smaller of a discussion, but we really, regulatory reform is a pretty nerdy topic, right? It can get pretty dense pretty quickly. If anyone has ever tried to read a regulatory filing, I salute to you. They are long and take a lot of time to get through, and very like legalese kind of language. So what we want to avoid in this is putting you all to sleep. So we're going to try to keep the session relatively interactive. Like we said, we're trying to spur discussion. So we're going to have opportunities for folks to speak. So Alex and Eric both have mics, and they'll be sort of moving around. So feel free to raise your hand and contribute. There you go. And to get the discussion started, we're actually going to talk a bit about the barriers that you all have seen and are facing. And these barriers, are not the fault of any individual who's unwilling to support clean energy. They're the fault of these systems that weren't designed to support clean energy. They're really systems that are in place over time. They've been put in place, and they just kind of manage the status quo. They're really focused on reliability, and that's a good thing. But we need innovation to be able to support renewable energy in these systems of regulation. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion about barriers. We want to hear from you all what you've seen, if what we're saying resonates with you, and maybe what's some of the unique factors of your jurisdiction that are creating regulatory barriers. And then we'll move into a discussion of some of our recommendations. So through our report, we made recommendations to the governments and regulators of those 4 jurisdictions. But a lot of those recommendations are actually quite common and could be applied with different nuances in each jurisdiction. So we'll talk about that. And we've got some case studies from our work in BC and the Yukon to share to sort of illustrate those examples. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Rosa to start the discussion.
Sure, so this is quite high level, and it's really just a compilation of the barriers that we found when we were looking at the different jurisdictions. So I'll go over them in quite a high level, but as Art says, it's really a starting point for further discussion. Our work is just a little snippet of consideration for quite a large topic, so we are interested in hearing from you. So when we looked at the common barriers across the jurisdiction, there were several that stood out. The first one being the mandate and the policy. The mandate of the public utility boards, public utility acts, and how they impact how the utilities can operate within the diesel communities, and the license they have for contributing to renewable energy projects. And also what we're starting to see more and more of is the misalignment of utility mandates with growing other priorities within governments, such as climate change and reconciliation, and then just not seeing that alignment. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. So the 3 areas that we're going to look at is the need for resource planning or the lack of resource planning, and financial constraints that many of the smaller jurisdictions are dealing with, which we did hear some of this morning. Yeah, so when we look at mandates, as Art was mentioning, the system for utility regulation was established many decades ago and was really based around what we heard from our utilities this morning, least cost reliable service, which needs to be the priority when we're talking about the delivery of electricity, especially when we're dealing with monopolies. The utilities have the monopolies, and the public utility boards serve the role of oversight of those monopoly organizations and have set the parameters of least cost reliable service, which is the benefit of all of us in this room and the way our societies run. But as I said, when we're starting to look at governments and passing commitments to climate action and treaty rights for reconciliation, we see a misalignment, and the utilities aren't empowered to address some of these other pressures in society under the current mandates in which they're operating. We see the same kind of barrier arise with resource planning in the small remote diesel communities. The diesel is a great way of providing power to the community. It's the least cost option, and it's been the assumed option for years and years now, and the communities have had safe, reliable power for decades because of the diesel generators in place. But there isn't currently the provision in most small remote diesel communities to require any kind of collaborative or integrated planning that looks forward and with targets and with community participation for planning for a future energy system that would have more renewables integrated into them. So without that requirement to have those discussions, diesel remains the only option in many cases. And finally, the largest barrier, again, it came up a lot in our discussion earlier this morning, the financial constraints. These are huge jurisdictions with small populations, small rate base, and are heavily dependent on federal funding in order to enable the development of any clean energy projects. And I thought the utilities did a great job this morning as well, talking about just the cost of doing business in the north and what a challenge that is compared to southern jurisdictions where it's easier to do the work. The building seasons are much longer and the logistics aren't as challenging. You want to add to any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the capacity side, what we also see is capacity constraints on the nation side to not only, they're doing projects, they're negotiating with utilities, But they also, to fully leverage the benefits of a regulator, they should be participating in regulatory processes and having their voices heard, right? And that's a major capacity burden. It requires legal representation often. It requires a high degree of both understanding and patience. And what happens when we see First Nations and Indigenous communities not participating in regulatory processes is the regulator is actually mandated to only make decisions based on the evidence that's presented in that proceeding. So if you don't have the First Nations in the room presenting their evidence, inevitably you're going to get a one-sided story and a one-sided decision. So, financial and capacity constraints are obviously a challenge on both sides. And, I think maybe we'll take a second here to just talk quickly about how this shows up in the Yukon, or one or two ways how it shows up in the Yukon, and then also in BC. I forget who we have first.
So the Yukon, and there's lots of Yukoners in the room, so please don't hesitate to jump up and correct me if I'm getting any of this a little bit wrong, but I think it's pretty straightforward and simple. So first I'll just give you a quick rundown on some of the major players in the Yukon. And what this image here shows that we've got the two utilities in the Yukon, Yukon Energy and ATCO. ATCO is responsible for distribution on the main grid, but it also plays the role of generation and distribution in the remote diesel communities, which we're largely focused on in this report. Although the Yukon is considered a remote diesel community in its entirety because it's not connected to the North American grid, this report really just focuses on the small microgrids in the Yukon that aren't connected to the main Yukon grid. So you can see from this image, similar to other jurisdictions, the Public Utility Act, which establishes the Yukon Utility Board. It's an economic regulator, and the two utilities looking after the main grid and the remote isolated grid. And you can also see on this image that Yukon Development Corporation, which owns Yukon Energy, and ATCO is a privately held utility in the Yukon. So it gets a bit more complicated here. I hope it's not going to be too difficult. I thought I'd be standing in front of a small screen pointing this all out. But this image, what I'm trying to do here is to show how the Yukon has advanced the opportunity for IPP projects in remote diesel communities under the existing regime of having an economic regulator without having made changes, say, to the Utility Act for those things we were talking about earlier, reconciliation and climate action. So in this image, starting from the IPP part, which I think is on your left, right? Wherever it is. So the Yukon's IPP policy. Yeah, okay. The Yukon government took the approach of issuing guidance to the Public Utility Board that allowed for IPP projects to happen in the remote diesel communities, and that was around the price that the utilities would be purchasing the power generated through the IPP projects from. So that eliminated the risk to the utilities in eliminated the risk that these projects wouldn't get approved by the utility board, and allowed for these projects to happen. And of course, we've seen this great success and now have utility size clean energy projects in each of the Yukon's remote diesel communities as a result of having a strong IPP policy on behalf of Yukon government, and also that direction that the Yukon government provided the Yukon Utility Board through its orders in council that allowed those projects to happen.
So what we see here is really like the order in council is refining a little bit the mandate of the utility board, or the sort of way that they carry out those mandates with specific instructions. So they're saying, if a utility comes to you with a community-led project and the price is based on this formula listed in the IPP policy, utility board, you will accept that. That's now within your interest to accept your mandate to accept. And BC took a slightly different route, and this is why they did this versus that. Sort of could be political, could be, there's a lot of different reasons, but ultimately not one is necessarily better than the other. So in BC, we have the public utility, BC Hydro, regulated by the BC Utilities Commission, BCUC, which is set up by the Utilities Commission Act. Apologies for the acronyms here. And I won't go into this whole diagram, but what I wanted to highlight is that this regulation of BC Hydro, as you may have heard in the last session, was really sort of tying BC Hydro's hands because, again, they could not be bringing forward projects that were going to not meet the sort of test of least cost, most reliable. And, you know, staying with the diesel status quo was sort of the easier option. You know, obviously, BC Hydro and NIA First Nations have developed a strong relationship, and, you know, this is sort of an opportunity for the government and First Nations and BC Hydro to sort of come up with, okay, there's this regulatory problem that BC is facing, how can we address this? You know, how can BC Hydro be sure that the BCUC is going to support their EPAs with remote clean energy projects? And the result is this regulatory tool, which is baked into the Clean Energy Act, which I didn't really talk about, but the Clean Energy Act sort of is like this overarching energy legislation in BC. And this tool is called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Regulation. So instead of publishing an IPP policy that BC Hydro would adopt and BCUC would sort of accept, instead what the government of BC has said is we're going to say that any project that BC Hydro engages in with a NIA community or in the non-integrated area, which, sorry, for those not from BC, this is what we call the communities not connected to the BC electrical grid. So any project supporting an NIA community or any EPAs is exempt from the economic aspect of BCUC's regulation. So now that sort of least cost, most reliable sort of underlying rule no longer applies. And what the BCUC is doing is making sure that the projects that are brought forward sort of fit the definition of a community-aligned energy project in the NIA. And their role is shifted a little bit from an economic regulator to sort of more of a compliance enforcer in that way. So these are sort of two of the examples of the sort of principal barrier, which a lot of the other jurisdictions are still facing. I think BC and the Yukon have sort of taken the lead on addressing this barrier of the regulator not having alignment in their decision-making to support these projects that are actually what communities want. The renewable energy projects that are going to cost more and require more investment in the energy grids. So with that, we wanted to take some time to actually open up the floor. You know, we provided a couple examples, but you know, this topic of regulation is broad and deep, and so we wanted to give everyone an opportunity to, you know, either comment on our examples, comment on other regulatory barriers you've faced, add color, add also, you know, what you see in your jurisdictions for those folks who are not in the BC or the Yukon. So here we go. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jack Van Camp. I'm from Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories. And there's two things that I wanted to bring up here. People in the Northwest Territories, I'm sure, are aware that in Hay River, there's been a transition from the Northwest Territories Power Corporation or from NACA to the Northwest Territories Power Corporation. And that happened because in the wisdom of the people who drafted our Cities, Towns, and Villages Act and our Public Utilities Act, it's within the power of any jurisdiction or any community to develop a franchise agreement with whatever utility company they want. And it's also within their power to develop their own utility company if that's what they want. And that's how in Hay River, it was a very long drawn-out legal battle. That's how the town of Hay River ultimately won the argument, because it's very clear that it's within the power of that community to develop a franchise agreement with the utility of their choice. And in that case, they chose to go with Northwest Territories Power Corporation. They didn't have to. They could have gone with another choice if they wanted to. But the point I want to mention here, to people from the Northwest Territories at least, they have that power to develop their own franchise agreements whenever and however they want, because Northwest Territories Power Corporation has no franchise agreements with anybody in the Northwest Territories, no current franchise agreements except Hay River. So that's an open opportunity for the communities in the Northwest Territories to get involved at their community level and directly contract with a franchise provider. The second thing that I want to sort of reinforce is this idea of getting involved in the regulatory process. In Fort Smith, the town of Fort Smith has decided to intervene in the general rate application from the Northwest Territories Power Corporation. They've intervened in the last 2 general rate applications. And as you said, it's real dirty work. It's trench warfare, and you have to be prepared to wade through a lot of very difficult material, and a lot of it is not helpful at all. But it is possible to have some impact if you do participate in those hearings. And the other point I wanted to mention is that, yes, there's a financial requirement to get representation in these hearings, but that, in the Northwest Territories at least, that's recoverable through the process, through the Public Utility Board. So yes, it's going to cost you some money, but you're going to get it back if you participate in those hearings. And our experience is that when you do provide evidence and you do participate in those hearings, the Public Utility Board listens, and they have to recognize the evidence that's placed before them. So if you don't put evidence before them, they don't get your evidence. If you do, at least they get your evidence, and it can be useful in the decision making.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank
Thank you. I just wanted to, I think you brought up a really important point, which is the role of the regulator as, like what Rosa mentioned at the beginning. The role of the regulator is really to ensure that the utilities that are monopolies are operating in the public interest. So when you actually have the opportunity to not go with a monopoly, that's another way to exercise your control in these jurisdictions where you can make choices about which utility you're using, and you can negotiate in that way. And then, of course, we're going to talk a lot more about participation in regulatory processes, but I cannot agree more that that's incredibly important.
Hi there, I'm Scott Jansen. I'm an electrical engineer consultant for various First Nations in British Columbia. Few comments and then a question. Federal funding for projects. I'd like to see a more streamlined federal funding pathway for First Nations to go through, especially if they have a community energy plan and it's bought into by the utility to say, hey, here's the funding for you, everybody's bought into it, we should move forward with this. That's more of a comment. The question is interties between provinces and territories. There's no economic interest for the utilities in Yukon or in British Columbia to build those transmission lines. The benefit is for lower energy prices for anybody. That doesn't really benefit the utilities, but it benefits all the people in the economy. So that's where I'd like to see the federal funding go towards that, and Indigenous-owned projects like in their territory. And then the other one that we were just talking about is grid-forming battery energy storage systems. The utility panel was talking about how complex it is to switch to batteries right away, and we don't have to. If you're in a diesel energy community, you can have a battery in there, you can run your whole grid off of the battery, and you can use the diesel to charge the battery at its best efficiency point. So we're going to actually save diesel just by putting in batteries. So these are just some high-level comments.
Yeah, I mean, just on that note, the provincial intertie, this is something that we actually don't cover in the report, but is really important, which is all of the utilities and all of the regulators are provincial or territorial entities. And the federal government doesn't actually have much regulatory power at all. And so it is really an interesting question of what's the role of the federal government in encouraging and supporting provinces and territories as they look to make these regulatory reforms. I just wanted to add that. Awesome.
My name is Klaus. I'm with the company Green Sun Rising. We develop and implement solar systems across Canada since 17 years. And I've dealt with probably 15 to 20 utilities over that time, and I do have bruises all over my body. Barriers, capacity restrictions. I understand that the utilities want grid stability first and foremost, and they are not controlling the intermittent renewable energy source. So I will give you an example actually from not a remote community, but from Ontario. Hydro One, being the largest utility in Ontario, is limiting renewable energy to 8% of baseload. 8%. I have two problems with that. First of all, baseload. Solar generation is not at night. We are at baseload at night. Baseload is lower than daytime peak. So using baseload as the reference, I have a problem with that. Second one is the number 8. 8 is a very, very low number. I'll give you a reference. Northwest Territory Power Corp is using 20%. That's obviously a better number, but that still is a number that needs to be reviewed. As a matter of fact, I'll give you another reference. On a windy, summer, sunny day, the whole grid in Germany was 100% renewable, and the world did not come to an end. Now, yes, they are interconnected with all the neighbors, and interconnection of grids really does help. So my point in response to the question of barriers is limitations, and different utilities use different numbers and different logic, and all of those do need to be revisited. I'll give you a final point. In an urban environment, you have overall higher loads, so that means a 8% number simply gives you a larger absolute number, which means that unless you get to high penetration levels, the 8% is not really a problem. It becomes a real problem in like non-urban areas, out in the county. The long county distribution lines, they do not have high utilization because they don't have the number of people. And we do, since years, run into that problem. And I do have projects that we cannot realize because of that 8% rule. And I've been in communication with Hydro One since years to revisit that. So my point in response is artificial limitations by the utility which limit the degree of renewable energy penetration. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I think when we look at the remote diesel grids in the north, and we heard about projects that are on the diesel grids in the Yukon right now, they're all being sized to meet the full load of the community when power is being produced. So, Old Crow, the diesel generators go off completely, and that is possible because of the battery and the microgrid controller. But moving a project from a small renewable energy project that won't impact grid stability to a project of that size is all about the partnerships, like we heard this morning, and also the policy environment that allows for those projects to happen and allows for those discussions to happen. So I appreciate, we do hear a lot about those kinds of barriers, but we're also seeing solutions to it. And the solutions are coming from those relationships and those opportunities to go big. And it's happening. We're building those projects.
Yeah, and I wanted to speak to the utilities and their limit on penetration. It's coming from a place of technical uncertainty where they recognize that if they go over that threshold, this is going to represent a significant pivot for their operating, right? For their business model, for their technical expertise. And one of the things that keeps utilities from doing that is the regulatory environment, right? So having a regulatory environment like in the Yukon, for example, that says, you know, if you have this policy, and correct me if I'm wrong, but does the Yukon policy include the battery?
Well, the Yukon policy, for all its greatness, does require the IPP to find the funding for the battery and microgrid controller, which is then owned by the utility. So they did problem solve it, and I think it's a bigger discussion about what future IPP projects look like and how that funding flows, perhaps. But yeah, right now, that's the way it's set up.
Yeah, but so basically there's a pathway towards integrating these new technologies that is accepted by the regulator, as opposed to the regulator sort of sticking its ground and saying, you know, actually all those new technologies, all this uncertainty, all this risk is actually more of a violation of the regulation than a fulfillment of that mandate. So that's why these sort of regulatory changes that actually comprehend these sort of new technologies and new investments that are needed are super, super important for moving forward, both from the utility side and from the nation side. I might take this opportunity to move. Oh, sorry, Dylan, why don't you go ahead?
Hey, I'm Dylan Hirma. Really interesting discussion, and I think there's a lot of interesting lessons that we can learn from what BC and the Yukon have done, but I think it's good to think of these as sort of like transitional steps on the road to like a more robust and self-determined solution. So what I've certainly seen in BC, and I think is the case everywhere, is governments are really reluctant to really open up and deeply tinker with their enabling legislation for their Utilities Acts, the Utilities Commissions Acts. And that makes sense in some respects because they like to maintain those levers of control as well as the ability to issue things like orders in council, because I would say especially right now, their overriding concern is around having an economic regulator that's keeping rates at or below the cost of inflation on the integrated grid, right? So like you end up with all these sort of Band-Aid solutions that are targeted to remote communities or even to sort of, you know, remote generation that may or may not be grid intertied. So I think really good example of that is just the way that the BCUC operates in a way that tries to maximize its efficiency and limit, actually, in a lot of ways, the opportunities to change the system from within. So a good example of that, I think, is in the most recent rate design for BC Hydro. The BCUC only allowed one intervener to represent all of the non-integrated communities, and even only allowed one First Nations community to intervene to represent all of the grid-tied First Nations communities in the entire province, which there's hundreds of. So I'm happy to hear that maybe the situation's a little more participatory in the Yukon than it is in BC, but I do think that that is an issue. And if I can sort of flip that around, I think that the work that's being done in BC over the long term is maybe the most promising model for other jurisdictions to look at, where they have done things like launched their Indigenous Utilities Regulation Inquiry and are also sort of soliciting input and proposals from First Nations that want to operate as a First Nations utility themselves. And so I think that there is a future there where individual communities and First Nations are able to operate as distribution utilities for their own communities and their own traditional territory, and to have that be overseen and regulated by a First Nations regulator, as opposed to the general regulator that regulates all of the other utilities and all of the non-Indigenous and or non-remote communities in the jurisdiction. So I think there's just tons of meat there, and it's still in its infancy. But if I was another jurisdiction looking at how to do it kind of right without the Band-Aids, I'd probably be looking to that model instead.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan. That's really, I mean, it's an incredible point to raise, and I wanted to highlight that this just reminded me of one other challenge related to participation and capacity, which is that many nations have government-to-government relationships. They have treaties, modern treaties that define how they would like to engage with the government, and that may or may not include engaging with the regulator. And so if the regulator is not set up to engage with the set up in the sort of language of the treaty, you have nations who maybe might not participate in the regulatory proceedings. And so, the whole system of energy regulation is built upon the colonial government system. And so I do think it's really important to think about, what does a sort of decolonized regulatory system look like moving forward? And that's actually going to be the second half of our discussion, but I saw some maybe half hands. Does anyone want? Christina? Alex?
Sorry. Oh. Sorry. I do too many things at once. Sorry.
Thanks so much. My name is Christina Hoika. I just wanted to add one very short comment that also might be useful. I did a review last year for a foundation. It hasn't come out yet, but I'm hoping it will soon. And one thing that struck me about this conversation and what they asked me to do was that they wanted me to document community energy across Canada and look at cooperatives and Indigenous nation owned and operated. And one of the major findings I found was, I guess probably previous to that, the Canada Energy Regulator cited some of the data that I did with some students. And I was surprised because they don't track it themselves. And when I started going through all of the data around municipal ownership and First Nation, Indigenous nation ownership and control, there's nowhere that the data, like we don't have data sets that are reliable. So we don't have, and the methodologies used to measure them are all different. So I just wanted to throw that in, that it is difficult, I suspect it's difficult to have that conversation when you don't know everything that's out there. There's not an awareness of all the different models that are happening, and then how to understand which ones are doing well. So.
Yeah, excellent point. So maybe we'll move forward here. Do you want to do these? I've been talking. Okay. I wanted to highlight a couple of the sort of common recommendations. We do in the report, we make specific recommendations for each jurisdiction based on the sort of political situation and the regulatory status quo, and where they are sort of in their journey of regulatory reform. But for now, we'll just sort of highlight some of these common ones. So, one really important thing is to think about, the economic mode of making decisions. So, an economic equation only by definition takes into account certain things. Can we expand that definition to include non-monetary benefits like the social cost of carbon, like the impacts on communities of having diesel generators? And actually I think this is one of the things that Dr. Hoika's work does really well, is like thinking about how do we start to quantify these benefits and to use them as both evidence in regulatory proceedings, but also as actually systemized, decision-making criteria. And then collaboration and participation. Obviously, we've talked a lot about Indigenous folks, in whatever form participating in regulatory proceedings, super important. But then also this idea of collaboration is really working with the government working with First Nations and Indigenous communities on reform. What are the barriers from your perspective? What are the barriers from our perspective? Governments and utilities do this as well, where they work together to identify pathways forward. And then lastly, harmonize utility and regulatory policy. So, when the government gives the utility the mandate, you need to support remote community energy, but the regulator doesn't have the same mandate, the utility is kind of in a bind. So quickly, I said, quantify true cost of carbon. Another model for potential decision making is like a benefit cost analysis rather than least cost most reliable, and that really puts the benefits first as sort of these are the benefits, and these are the benefits we're going for, and now let's pick the least cost that delivers those benefits. And then also, regulators are actually not empowered to make decisions based on non-economic factors. In BC, they have this very special language where the regulator is authorized to consider the energy objectives, one of which is fostering the development of rural and remote community energy. But that consideration only comes after the economic analysis. So economic analysis, all things easier, then we can consider remote community energy development. But reconciliation actually isn't in there. And that's been a recommendation made by First Nations in BC for a while to actually let the regulator, and actually in the inquiry that Dylan was talking about, the regulator said to the BC government, instruct us through legislation or regulation to include reconciliation in our decision-making factor. So, you know, and in many cases, the regulator is actually tied by what's written down on paper. And so they're saying, hey, we actually recognize that we need to change the way that we're doing things, but we need you to explicitly tell us to do that. Collaboration and participation, some sort of sub-recommendations are to really build formal capacity for government-to-government collaborations on energy. So like I mentioned before, many nations have treaties where they have government-to-government relations. But you know, what we really need is the specific focus on energy for these government-to-government relations to build consensus and come up with the fixes that actually work for the nations and are going to advance these kinds of projects. And then sort of actually before that is really this idea of increasing funding and training, like increasing literacy around regulation, which in that regard, it's good that we have such a big room here. But yeah, regulation is sort of thought of as this really dense topic that is inaccessible. So it's really important to increase the literacy to allow for First Nations to have informed participation, to have funding for that kind of training, have funding for representation and for experts who can support First Nations through the process. And then lastly, harmonizing utility and regulatory policy. You know, one really great way to do this is to implement an IPP policy. We say improve as well because no IPP policy is perfect. All of them have nuances that could really be improved. And then another aspect is to really require, as a baseline, community-aligned energy planning. BC has been doing a lot of really interesting work in this regard. BC Hydro and BC First Nations have been at the regulator talking about this, and I think the pathway forward is exciting. There's a lot of collaboration there. But yeah, making sure that the long-term resource planning that the utility is doing and presenting to the regulator is aligned with what the community actually wants with their community energy plans and their expectations for the future and for future generations. So I think with that, oh, we have these examples. How much time do we have? Yeah, so I guess, do you want to go first?
Sure.
I feel like I've been talking a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, so we'll just talk really quickly about some of the recommendations that Pembina did make in its report, and then we really want to see this as a jumping off point to the discussion that follows, so we won't go into this for too long. And Art did go over some of these to begin with, but you can see on this lovely little diagram I made, the bits in green are the areas that we would suggest there could be some movement forward. And I guess I would just say that this is really super idealized. It doesn't really tackle where the money comes from, and it also doesn't really tackle the priorities for every community. Like, I'm making recommendations here for the Yukon, but every Yukon community does have a large-scale project. So when we talk about starting to reduce diesel consumption, priorities in the future may be more focused on demand-side management or diesel reduction in areas other than further IPP projects. But just preface this on the fact that this is about if we were to build some more IPP projects in the Yukon, in the remote diesel grids, really strong emphasis on wanting that to be a community planning process. And we see that the joint operating committees that are forming around the existing projects are opening up dialogue between the communities and the utility and creating those opportunities for discussion about power loads and opportunities for integrating more renewables. So having that collaborative planning process, perhaps focused around some targets where we're going in the long-term future that may provide some options to diesel reliance. Creating more opportunities for Yukon First Nations to be participating in the regulatory processes, like Art mentioned, because largely those processes have been going on in isolation of the First Nations, just for one reason or another, and also making some legislation, changing the legislation to expand that scope of what the Public Utility Board is looking at to include other priorities of our society today, such as climate action and reconciliation. With regards to the IPP policy itself, Yukon is held up as having a strong IPP policy, but of course, like now we're into the future projects and into revisions, and suggestions around the IPP policy could again look at strengthening those targets for diesel reduction in the remote communities. Looking at the grid as a whole, instead of taking a project by project basis, as I mentioned, the IPPs in the Yukon are responsible for those grid infrastructure upgrades that are required in order to enable those IPP projects to be developed. But if we had a more holistic approach to that future movement, future transition, there may be another way of doing it. And also the risk piece, like how do we kind of find a balanced risk so that we can see the integration of more renewables and the risk isn't too high on the utilities, not too high on the rate base, not too high on the communities. We don't really have the solutions to any of this, of course, but there needs to be another way of, an improved way of doing these things, and maybe that will be within the existing system, or maybe in 5 years we'll see a shift towards a different system altogether. But this is just a really super high-level overview of maybe where the Yukon could go.
Yeah, and I'll try and be quick here, but you see there's a lot of sort of dashed lines here, and what I wanted to acknowledge with the dashed lines is that these are sort of more informal channels that in certain cases should become more formal channels. So at the top we have DRIPA, and for those who don't know, that's the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which was passed into law in BC in 2019, I believe. And it basically says BC is required to update all of its laws to be in alignment with the UN Declaration. And this presents a really interesting opportunity because the Clean Energy Act, the Utility Commissions Act have not been updated to address UNDRIP or to be in alignment with UNDRIP. And building off of the study that Dylan mentioned on Indigenous utilities, there's a real opportunity to radically reimagine what the regulation of Indigenous-led projects looks like and really bake that participation and integration of Indigenous voices into the entire process from community planning, regulatory proceedings, regulatory approvals, who is making the decisions on what BC Hydro is doing, and essentially really make sure that First Nations voices have an equal say at the table and are really in charge of what the energy systems are going to be in their communities. And then the other line that I've just added here is this second orange line. So in the 2023-2024, BCUC has sort of adopted a new strategy for reviewing long-term resource plans with BC Hydro that is much more amenable to BC Hydro working with the community at the community's pace and bringing that forward, not based on the formula or the layout that the BCUC has defined, but based on the layout that the community wants with the community's action plans, the community's load forecasts, and the sort of long-term vision of the community. So essentially, there's a lot of opportunity to move these things forward with bigger reforms, but for the jurisdictions that haven't sort of taken that initial step of addressing this least cost, most reliable, like that's really the strongest recommendation. And we've presented you with sort of 2 examples of the jurisdictions that have tried to do that. So with that, we have some time for some more discussion. So I would love to hear, other thoughts, solutions, visions for some of the regulatory barriers that folks are seeing in their jurisdictions.
Hello, my name is John Sargentson. I'm with currently Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. Before that, I was with the Government of Yukon, and before that, I was with the Council of Yukon First Nations. And when I was at CYFN, we ran an event called the Energy Summit, YFN Energy Summit, and I just wanted to, I guess, articulate some of the things that match with what you guys are saying. So for example, energy planning, that was something that a lot of First Nations articulated that they wanted to be an integral part of. I think we saw here in the Yukon, things like the 10-year renewable electricity plan kind of fall apart. I think because of a lack of that. I don't know all the details, I wasn't around then, so I don't want to misspeak, but I think that was a huge thing was having First Nations be integral to those processes. Of course, we have to be careful because there's an administrative burden and there is such a thing as too much collaboration. We don't want to slow things down too much, but yeah, like there needs to be more integration there. And I don't know exactly how that would work in terms of like, would you need to revise the Utilities Act? I'm not sure, but I think that's something that I would definitely echo from you guys. The other thing that I would really want to share is I think when it comes to things like the IPP policy and the microgen policy, that we need a heavier dose of technocracy there. I think we saw a big issue with some of the design of those programs, especially in terms of the reimbursement of the energy that they were purchasing. We didn't have any sort of focus on winter generation, things like that. And I think we're heading in that way, but I think that's something that everyone needs to recognize is that yes, renewables have lower cost generation, but they also have system costs that come with them to integrate. So that needs to be holistically planned for, and I think we need people that understand that. I think sometimes people developing policy have more of a surface level understanding of these issues. I mean, let's look at Germany, for example. Their wholesale power is very cheap, but the retail power is very expensive, and their emissions factors are higher than Alberta's, but they have a ton of solar and wind. So clearly there's some issues with system level design there that we need to rectify, and that needs to be considered when it comes to resource planning.
Hi. My name is Al Foster from the Yukon.
He'll go next.
Go ahead. I have a question. In the Yukon, we have the territorial government passed the Clean Energy Act. Part of that is a push to the adoption of EVs. With EVs, we have the possibility of going to bi-directional charging, such that the car becomes part of the grids. But most of the utility acts that I've looked at don't seem to deal with that particular concept. Do you have any recommendations or insights on how that should be dealt with within the utility acts?
Honestly, no. But it's a really important point, and I think there's a lot of really smart engineering minds working on it, and I think the US is a jurisdiction that's actually starting to do that a bit more. So we maybe could look there, but that really was not at all in the scope of our research. But it's definitely a cool opportunity.
Thanks.
If you set up a battery so it supplies a residential load, or a car as the battery supplies a residential load, that happens within all of the current regulations right now. There's no reason why you can't supply your own load with your car, but there is a lot of restrictions on supplying the grid with your car. So I think just that key part has to be communicated properly.
Apologies about earlier. I'm Graham Lovely with MCW Consultants. We're electrical mechanical design engineers for buildings, specifically. And I'm interested in scope of your reports and other things on decarbonization on the building system side as well. I'm assuming you were looking mostly in generation. Has there been much discussion, and I haven't heard a lot of it yet, on load reduction in buildings, on fuel switching in buildings, trying to reduce the carbonization impact of the buildings, which is where we're actually burning most of it? Just interested in that because that obviously plays into how much energy we need to deliver, what kind of energy we need to deliver, and how.
Yeah, I can speak to the BC context. So the BC current sort of regulatory regime actually requires BC Hydro to do as much as it can on DSM before it brings on new generation. Alicia can correct me if I'm not exactly right on that, but essentially, there's a high emphasis on demand-side management and energy efficiency in the current status quo. And BC Hydro and the BC government actually have pretty comprehensive funding to support that. And what we've seen is a huge uptake in remote communities on the efficiency side. But the sort of update to the regulatory aspect is that actually, instead of the BCUC saying to BC Hydro, you need to do everything on DSM first, they're recognizing that DSM in remote communities is a whole different beast than running a provincial-wide program. It really has to be led from the community. You need high degree of buy-in. You're going into people's homes, doing renovations, doing, replacing appliances and things like that. So it really needs to be led from the community side. And so what BC has elected to do is actually, rather than require that, instead say, include that in your community energy plan that you're developing in collaboration. And that's just a little bit more flexibility where, the intent there was good, but what's most important is that the community is empowered to make decisions about their energy system based on where they're at and where they have the capacity to actually move these things forward. But we have seen super high uptake in BC, tons of heat pumps in remote communities, and tons of energy efficiency projects. So it definitely holds a huge opportunity if the funding is there.
Don Kilsauce Tramores. I am the current chair of the RiRC group that's shown on the slides for BC, as well as co-founder with Leona, David, Sean. There are others here, but from the non-integrated First Nation working group, which Arthur also is our support for it. But a lot of our focus came from the changes, the ebb and flow of what political pressures were happening in BC. We just finished an election. We're going through a federal election now. And, when I say the ebbs and flows of government, we're changing to whatever political climate they feel is most important. Right now, we're having the knee-jerk reaction to tweets from the president. And, we suddenly abandon climate when we look at renewables as a priority, and it's because we're looking at those priorities because renewables are making us more responsible stewards of the land, which Indigenous people have always done for countless time immemorial. We're stewards of the land. And so when I saw a couple points in the slides that we just seen, we talk about reconciliation and what UNDRIP or DRIPA mean to the government or to organizations that work within our territories. I think that reconciliation is not enough, and I'm channeling my Leona right now, and there's a big need for respect and reciprocity in the organizations that work within our territories, because there's no territory within all of Canada that does not touch a First Nations title and rights. And it's something that's really built into my knowledge, and the Haida have just had that federally and provincially recognized. So it makes me wonder what changes are going to happen for our nation now that we have that recognition. And it's important because what we want to see is things that are occurring within our territory are long-term plans, not short-term reactions. And renewable projects are so important for the environment, and I just hope that everybody keeps that in mind, because my question I always propose to people is, what happens when DRIPA or UNDRIP fails? Because it happens all the time.
Yeah, thank you, Trent. And I think at this point we're holding people from their lunch. So thank you so much for all the insightful comments and for listening. Hope we didn't bore too many of you to death, and looking forward to the rest of the conference.
Art, thanks for carrying it.
Thanks.
I found it was so difficult having